like to welcome everyone to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series today. And we have the pleasure of being with the Honourable Irwin Cotler of Canada. And I'll give you a little bit more information about him in just a minute. Today's lecture is the Leonard B. Torben Memorial Lecture. Let me give you just a little bit of a word about Len Torben. He was born in Montreal, a graduate of McGill University, where he did his PhD in fluid dynamics. He was a leading research scientist, was the head of R&D for Exxon for many years, and went on to establish his own nanofiber group. Those of us who knew Len knew what a brilliant and special person he was. We thank Marcia Torben for underwriting this series of lectures in memory of Len Torben. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Cotler. He has been one of the leading people in Canada and internationally working on human rights, issues of anti-Semitism for a number of decades now. He's the founder and the international chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights and the emeritus professor of law at McGill University. Professor Cotler is the former Minister of Justice, and he's an active international human rights lawyer. In November 2020, he was named Canada's special envoy in preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. His office's achievements and awards are too numerous for us to list here today. One of the things that came up in the pre-roll was his appointment of Rosie Abella to the Supreme Court. She was here in Santa Fe a couple of years ago, and it was quite an honor to be able to meet her and to know more about her history and trajectory. And thank you for being important in naming women to the Supreme Court of Canada. You know, the best summary about Professor Cotler's work was given by his peers in the Law Society of Upper Canada when it gave him the inaugural Human Rights Award in 2015. And the citation began saying, "It's to the Honourable Irwin Cotler's tireless efforts to ensure peace and justice for all." Then it went on to say, in his varied roles as law professor, constitutional and comparative law scholar, international human rights lawyer, counsel to prisoners of conscience, public intellectual, peace activist, member of parliament, and Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Mr. Cotler has been a leader and a role model. Through his advocacy both in Canada and internationally, he has transformed the lives of many. And reiterating what the Law Society said, I think that we can all agree that Professor Cotler has made a difference in Canada and across the world in his leadership and advocacy for justice, human rights, and in combating the issues of racism, anti-Semitism, and hatred. And we thank you for all of that. And it is a pleasure to welcome Professor Cotler.
Thank you for those very kind words of introduction. I want to begin by commending the organizers of the Santa Fe lecture for your abiding respect and commitment to human dignity, which these lectures reflect and represent. And delighted to have the privilege of participating in the Leonard Torben Memorial Lecture. There is a Montreal connection here, and we all share in his great contributions and legacy. And I want to as well commend his wife and his family for establishing this lectureship, because it leaves an important legacy, both with respect to him, his contributions, and, as I mentioned at the beginning, the abiding respect for tolerance and human dignity. In that regard, I delighted that Justice Rosie Abella was one of the predecessors here. I always used to say that one of the most important things that a Minister of Justice and Attorney General does is his participation in judicial appointments. And she has been one of the great jurists, not only in Canada, but internationally. And I have to say that when I look back on my years as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, one of the most inspiring parts of my role at the time was to be able to participate in her appointment, and then to see the incredible legacy that she has left, not only as a judge, but as an internationally renowned jurist whose principles and precedents are respected the world over. We meet today at an important moment of remembrance and reminder, of bearing witness and of taking action. We meet, as it happens, on the occasion of the 74th anniversary of the Genocide Convention, which we commemorated this past Friday on December 9th, which went largely unnoticed in the international community. The Genocide Convention, known otherwise as the Never Again Convention, but which tragically has been violated again and again. And we meet also on the occasion of the 74th anniversary, yesterday, December 10th, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, spoken of as the Magna Carta of Human Rights, but which regrettably continues to be violated in every one of its particulars. And we meet at an important historical inflection moment where we are witnessing and experiencing a resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, assault on what we characterize as the rules-based international order, assault on human rights, and political prisoners as a looking glass into that assault. And we meet at the same time as we are witnessing an alarming rise in global anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, which my colleague Ahmed Shahid has spoken of as being toxic to democracies, an assault on our common humanity, the canary in the mineshaft of global evil. And so at this point, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we have learned? And more importantly, what is it that we must do? What I'd like to do is share with you today 3 case studies of this resurgent global authoritarianism and assault on the rules-based international order, and respectively 3 case studies of political prisoners who are looking glasses. That would be, with regard to the case studies, Putin's Russia and Vladimir Kara-Murza as a case study, Khamenei's Iran, and here too I'm using that term to distinguish it from the people and publics in Iran who are the targets of the mass domestic oppression in Iran as we meet, and Xi Jinping's China, where with regard to Iran, I will be speaking of Nasrin Sotoudeh, the iconic imprisoned Iranian human rights lawyer. And with respect to China, I will speak of Dr. Wang Xiaoning, the longest imprisoned political prisoner in China. Following that, I'll share with you some perspectives on anti-Semitism, drawing upon my own experience in my last 2 years as special envoy. Let me begin with Putin's Russia. As we enter upon the 10th month of the unprovoked and premeditated invasion of Ukraine, of the criminal aggression in Ukraine, underpinned by war crimes and crimes against humanity, intensifying with its missile attacks as we meet, missile attacks that target the very necessities of life in Ukraine, targeting residential areas, targeting hospitals, targeting schools, water, energy, plunging millions of Ukrainians as we meet into darkness, devastation, and deprivation. And as the report of the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, which I chair, its landmark report in May 2022, and we have to realize that the findings in that report have only been intensified since. That report, and it was endorsed by leading international law scholars and genocide scholars all over the world, had three principal findings: that Putin's Russia was engaged in standing breaches of the Genocide Convention. These included, number one, an ongoing, direct, and public incitement to genocide, which is, and is not always appreciated, a standalone crime under the Genocide Convention, whether or not acts of genocide follow, as the Supreme Court of Canada and international tribunals have otherwise held. Second principal finding, that genocidal intent can be inferred from the pattern and policy of the war crimes and crimes against humanity, intensifying, as I mentioned, as I speak. And third, that there is a serious risk of genocide in Ukraine, arising both from the direct and public incitement to genocide, from the war crimes and crimes against humanity, from the genocidal intent, from the pattern and policy of these inhumane crimes. And when a risk of genocide arises, there is a responsibility on state parties to the Genocide Convention to act. The convention, which, as I said, we commemorated this past Friday, is a convention on the prevention and punishment of genocide. You are not to await the actual occurrence of genocide until you are obliged to act. When a serious risk of genocide has emerged, that threshold already obliges the international community to act. And we have seen demonstrations of military support, political support, diplomatic support, economic support, humanitarian assistance, application of sanctions by the community of democracies, late in coming, but now in place. But I want to suggest to you that there are a number of important legal, juridical remedies which should be undertaken to address these standing breaches of the Genocide Convention, these ongoing war crimes and crimes against humanity, this criminal aggression against Ukraine. And for reasons of time, I'll just enumerate these initiatives. Number one, we need to establish an independent international tribunal for the crime of aggression in Ukraine. It's not as well known as it deserves to be that the crime of aggression is not prosecutable under the existing legal remedies. And so we have to establish an independent tribunal in order to hold Putin and those aiding and abetting in that crime of aggression responsible and prosecuted under the law. And I have joined together with my colleagues, Hans Corell, the former legal advisor to the United Nations, and David Crane, the former special prosecutor for the Sierra Leone International Tribunal, proposing a white paper and proposing drafts for how that court can be brought about. And I'm delighted that not only is Ukraine leading at this point the international initiative to establish such a court, but more and more of the community of democracies have also engaged in their support. And we need that broad-based support to adopt a UN General Assembly resolution and establish that tribunal. Second, we need to support Ukraine's interstate complaint against Russia, which it launched under the International Court of Justice immediately after Russia's invasion, because Russia's invasion and criminal aggression was accompanied by what might be called a denazification trope, where Russia was justifying its criminal aggression by saying that it was combating the Nazi Ukraine. And so Ukraine launched this interstate legal initiatives under the International Court of Justice for Russia's false and abusive misrepresentation of the Genocide Convention and its own actions. And I'm pleased that the International Court of Justice issued a preliminary ruling which condemned Russia's use and false use of the denazification trope and called on Russia to cease and desist from its aggression, which it has not yet done. And therefore, we are pursuing also this interstate complaint in the International Court of Justice. And I'm delighted that my own country, Canada, just several days ago, joined the Netherlands in also intervening in support of Ukraine's position. The third is we need to support the investigation and prosecution of Russian war criminals for their war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide before the International Criminal Court. Number four, we need to support the Ukrainian justice system, which has already opened 30,000 investigations into Russian war crimes. Number five, we need to encourage countries that have a framework of universal jurisdiction, which authorizes them to try and prosecute Russian war criminals who are on their territory. Canada is one of those countries to initiate prosecutions in order to combat the impunity and to bring Russian war criminals to justice. Number six, we need to support the Commission of Investigative Inquiry established by the UN Council on Human Rights to investigate Russian war crimes and crimes against humanity. And finally, we need to support the brave Russian civil society. As we meet, over 10,000 have been arbitrarily detained for nothing other than even referencing, let alone critiquing, Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine. And where Vladimir Kara-Murza has emerged as the looking glass with respect to both shining a spotlight on Russia's external aggression in Ukraine and its massive domestic repression at home in Russia. Vladimir Kara-Murza is a distinguished Russian patriot, dissident, leading democratic opposition leader, author, filmmaker, journalist, and one of the global architects of justice for Sergei Magnitsky sanctions to secure justice for victims and accountability for the human rights violators, and where he has a distinctive connection to the community of democracies, was Vladimir Kara-Murza, who worked together with the late Senator John McCain, who worked together with Senator Ben Cardin, so to work to adopt Magnitsky sanctions in the US. There is a Canadian connection as well. Vladimir Kara-Murza happens to be a close friend and colleague, and he came to Canada in 2011, together with Boris Nemtsov, then the Democratic opposition leader in Russia, and Bill Browder, then leading the campaign for Magnitsky sanctions, to support my tabling then of justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation in Canada. Fast forward to February 2015, Boris Nemtsov was assassinated outside the Kremlin. The Canadian Foreign Affairs Committee, of which I was then a member, met, held hearings. Vladimir Kara-Murza was a principal witness at those hearings on the path towards adoption of Magnitsky sanctions in Canada. He returned to Russia after testifying, was poisoned, and almost died. In 2017, we reconvened the Foreign Affairs Committee again. Vladimir Kara-Murza once again was a principal witness, returned to Russia, once again was poisoned, survived, and became a leading architect for the adoption of Magnitsky sanctions, which were adopted in Canada, the UK, the European Union, Australia, and the like. In March 2022, after Russia invaded the Ukraine, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who had moved his family to Washington, where he's also a columnist for the Washington Post and had been splitting his time between Moscow and Washington, returned to Moscow because, as he put it, he wanted to be amongst his people and to support his people as Putin invaded the Ukraine. What happened is that he was then arrested in Moscow while sitting in his car outside his apartment about to return to Washington, falsely charged with a trumped-up charge of disobeying the police, then charged with a fake news law that Putin had initiated upon the criminal invasion of Ukraine, making any mention of the war in Ukraine a criminal offense, and then more recently indicted for high treason, which alone carries a sentence of 20 years. And so he is languishing in a Moscow prison as we meet, and I would commend to you, given the good work that your Santa Fe Institute does, that you support and take up the case of Vladimir Kara-Murza, as I said, now languishing in a Moscow prison, because his voice is speaking for all of us. He is the embodiment of the struggle for democracy in Russia and internationally, the embodiment of the struggle for human rights domestically and internationally. And this leads me now to the second case study, what I would call Khamenei's Iran, or perhaps one should say Ibrahim Raisi's Iran. Ibrahim Raisi is the president of Iran, but his legacy of criminality and corruption has continued not only to go unpunished, but to be rewarded. Ibrahim Raisi was a deputy special prosecutor and member of the Iran Death Commission in 1988, responsible for the execution of more than 5,000 Iranian dissidents. For that, he was promoted subsequently to the position of Attorney General, where he presided over the highest ever per capita executions of any country in the world. And as I'm speaking now as president of Iran, he is once again presiding over more than 500 executions in 2022 alone. Ibrahim Raisi went on to become, after that, Chief Justice of Iran, where in Chief Justice, he oversaw the massive domestic repression of the protests in 2019, which we have forgotten, that ended up killing 1,500 Iranians and injuring thousands and more and imprisoning thousands more. And he is now presiding over the massive domestic repression in Iran as we meet, after having sanitized a commission of inquiry into the downing of Ukrainian airliner 752, which resulted in the deaths of Iranian Canadians, for which a Canadian court characterized it as a crime against humanity and a terrorist act. So for all these acts of criminality that the president of Iran has been engaged in from 1988 to the present day, not only has he not been held accountable, but he has been rewarded successively for his criminality and corruption and crimes against humanity since. And that has included also the arrest and imprisonment of Nasrin Sotoudeh, the iconic Iranian human rights lawyer, sometimes spoken of as the Mandela of Iran. I first took up her case as a parliamentarian in 2011, when she was then falsely charged and sentenced to 6 years in prison. As a result of international advocacy, at the time she was released after 3 years, only to be arrested 3.5 years ago. Nasrin Sotoudeh has been arrested and indicted for nothing other than going down the line on behalf of the women's movement in Iran, which has been the target of institutionalized gender apartheid for decades, for going down the line for juveniles destined for execution, down the line for journalists whose freedom of speech has been silenced, down the line for other lawyers who, for defending political prisoners, themselves ended up being political prisoners, down the line for other political prisoners, down the line for Baha'is who've been falsely arrested, persecuted, and prosecuted, until she, 3.5 years ago, was charged and convicted and sentenced to 38 years in prison, a virtual death sentence for a woman in her late 50s, and 148 lashes. And speaking of a culture of impunity, 2 days after that abhorrent conviction and sentence, Iran was elected to the UN Commission on Women's Rights. And I mention this because in 3 days from now, there will be a vote to remove Iran from the UN Commission on Women's Rights. And I hope that we will all be engaged in this ongoing campaign now to remove Iran from the Women's Commission, as that represents a scandalous assault on international human rights, on the international legal system. And as we commemorate, as I said, the 74th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights just yesterday, to have Iran sitting on the UN Commission for Women's Rights, given its ongoing assault on women's rights, of which Nasrin Sotoudeh is a looking glass, is a simple travesty of justice that has to be addressed and redressed. And this brings me to the third case study, and that is Xi Jinping's China, where Xi Jinping has spoken of what he calls the 5 sins, but which are really the 5 acts of criminality by Xi Jinping and the CCP leadership in China. The first are the mass atrocities in the Xinjiang region of China, targeting the Uyghurs of China. Mass atrocities which the Canadian Parliament became one of the first of parliaments to determine that these were acts of genocide, which here too our Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights released a report authorized as well and supported by the leading scholars and genocide scholars, international and genocide scholars in the world, which concluded that China was engaged in all 5 acts of genocide under the Genocide Convention in its mass atrocities targeting the Uyghurs. Second, Xi Jinping's assault not only on the democracy movement, but on democracy itself in Hong Kong, continuing as we speak in the false conviction and sentence of Jimmy Lai, a leading journalist in China, among others, as well as the father of the democracy movement in Hong Kong. Number 3, the ongoing persecution, prosecution of the Falun Gong, the spiritual meditation movement in China, now in its 23rd year of persecution, for which the Chinese government has taken credit of speaking about, quote, the eradication of this movement. Number 4, the repression of Tibet. Number 5, the menacing of Taiwan. And what is perhaps less well known is that China imprisons more journalists than any other country in the world, as it imprisons the lawyers who would defend them. Which brings me to the case of Dr. Wang Xiaoning, who's got both an American and Canadian connection. Dr. Wang Xiaoning was a Chinese doctor who first came to McGill University and received his PhD from McGill University in Montreal in 1982. He then said, while it would be good to be a doctor, it would be more important to promote democracy in China. And so he came to the US and established the Overseas China Democracy Movement. Fast forward to 2002, went on a visit to Vietnam with his colleagues. He was apprehended, brought back to China, and in a sham, a closed trial, unrepresented by counsel, without access to any diplomatic representation, he was charged and convicted of both the crimes of treason and terrorism and sentenced to life imprisonment in solitary confinement, where he has suffered a series of debilitating strokes. And reflective and representative of the cruelty of China in its massive domestic repression, when his daughter, Tiana Wang, a graduate of McGill Law School, named after the Tiananmen Square, after she gave birth to his grandchild in Canada, then sought to visit her father in China, visit him in prison. She had been denied any visa for years. Finally given a visa in 2019, went to China, landed in Beijing, only to be rebuffed, arrested, turned back, and sent back on a plane to Canada. And so he could not see his daughter, nor see his infant grandchild, as he continues, as we meet, to languish in a brutal Chinese prison, ongoing torture in solitary confinement, reflective and representative as a looking glass into Xi Jinping's China. Which brings me at this point now to the situation of a resurgent global anti-Semitism, a resurgence of the oldest, longest, most enduring, most lethal and toxic of hatreds, and most global, one which mutates and metastasizes over time, but which is grounded in one generic trope, one historical generic trope, and that is, which gives expression to a variety of other tropes, but that is of the Jews and the Jewish people as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil, reflecting and representing whatever is the zeitgeist or canon of the moment. So when the zeitgeist was the Christian religion, the Jews were held to be guilty of deicide. That morphed into the blood libel. And then today we see the great replacement theory in that regard. When it was the Black Plague, then the Jews were held out to be the poisoners of the wells, and where in its contemporary expression, Jews, the Jewish people, Israel, are held to be responsible for manufacturing the COVID virus, for causing its spread, and in yet another trope for profiting from it. When race was a zeitgeist, then the Jews were the non-Aryans. When human rights emerged as the new secular religion of our time, something that I applauded in the 70s then as a law professor, well then Israel, the Jewish people, was held out as the meta human rights violator of our time. In other words, a new geopolitical antichrist of our time. And when anti-racism emerged as a zeitgeist of our time, when in particular after the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001 turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people, when anti-racism became the organizing frame, then here too, the zeitgeist became as the Jews in a kind of double Pincer movement, where, for example, Jewish students on the campuses are held out to be representatives of the white privilege, if not supremacist movement, and apologists for the white apartheid state of Israel. And this too has entered into the lexicon. And so let me, at this point, summarize, if I may, some of the principal findings of my involvement as special envoy for preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism of the last 2 years. The first is not only that we are witnessing an alarming rise in anti-Semitism. For example, 2021 studies of the Anti-Defamation League in the US or the League for Human Rights in in Canada both demonstrated the highest level of anti-Semitic acts since they began their anti-Semitic audits over 40 years ago. And that held true for investigations in the UK, in France, and elsewhere. And not only the highest rise in anti-Semitic incidences, but an ongoing rise in hate crimes targeting Jews, and an ongoing and exponential and incendiary rise in hate on the internet. And you've been experiencing and witnessing this. I need not go into detail on this. Kanye West is only the most recent of examples of the weaponizing of the social media with respect to that kind of incendiary anti-Semitism. But the more disturbing findings have been the following. Number one, what I would call the normalizing, mainstream, legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political, popular, campus, media, and sports culture. The absence of outrage, very often underpinned by indifference and inaction. Second, the globalization phenomenon. By globalization, I don't only mean highest levels of anti-Semitism in the US, Canada, and globally, but the interactive character of that globalization. So, for example, when during the Hamas war against Israel in May 2021, convoys went through the streets of London, England, saying, "F the Jews, will rape your daughters," similar convoys went through the streets in Canada saying the same things. And so you had not only a repetition, but replicating of that kind of demonization and threat that was taking place and being orchestrated globally. A third thing has been what I've called the marginalization of anti-Semitism in the overall struggle against racism and hate. We must be engaged, as here in Canada we seek to be, in systemic racism against Indigenous peoples, against Blacks and people of color, Asian Canadians, American Asians, Muslims, and the like. But what I have found is that both within and without government, the actual education and training and combating against racism and hate has not included also education and training of combating anti-Semitism. One example was at the calls to action by the Privy Council clerk of the Privy Council of Canada, important calls to action to combat racism and hate, refer to all the other racism and hate that I've referenced, but made no reference to anti-Semitism. Which brings me to a fourth and disturbing phenomenon that I have found, and that is what I would call the laundering of anti-Semitism under the very cover of anti-racism. Indeed, that led to the situation in Canada where it was discovered the actual anti-racism branches of the Canadian government committed to combating anti-racism had been giving grants to a preeminent racist and anti-Semite in Canada, who is targeting not only Jews with his anti-Semitism, but also Indigenous people, Blacks, and the like, representing what we have always been able to appreciate, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And we have found also the laundering of anti-Semitism and what I call universal public values under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the very culture of human rights, as it is laundered under the very struggle against racism itself. How many know that the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, meeting in the immediate aftermath of the World Conference Against Racism and Hate in Durban 2001, met for the first time to put one country in the docket of the accused? It was not Russia, it was not China, it was not Iran, it was not Syria. The first country ever put into the docket of the accused by the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, the cornerstone of international humanitarian law, was Israel. And twice since, those contracting parties have met, and in both occasions, once again, put Israel into the docket of the accused. None of this is intended to suggest, and I would not presume to suggest at any time, that somehow Israel is above the law, or that Israel is not responsible for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law like any other state because of the Holocaust or the horrors of Jewish history. Not at all. But the problem is not that Israel should seek, or that anyone should seek on Israel's behalf, that it be above the law. The problem is that Israel systematically denied equality before the law in the international arena. Not that human rights standards are applied to Israel, which they must, but that these standards are not applied equally to everyone else. Not that Israel must respect human rights, which she is obliged to do, but her own human rights deserve equal respect. And it's the singling out of the Jewish state for selective opprobrium and indictment that is not only prejudicial to Israel and the Jewish people, and with its fallout for diaspora Jews who are then held out to be apologists for the apartheid state of Israel. But all this undermines the integrity of the UN, corrupts the authority of international law, erodes the struggle for human rights, demeans the struggle and the real struggle against racism and the real struggle that took place against apartheid. And as someone who was involved in the anti-apartheid movement and who was arrested myself in South Africa in 1981, it is demeaning to make that comparison between Israel and South African apartheid. It shows not only an ignorance of Israel in its diversity, but shows an ignorance of what apartheid was all about. And so may I conclude by saying that what is needed now with respect to combating anti-Semitism, as I indicated, what was needed in combating the resurgent global authoritarianism manifesting itself in Putin's Russia, in Khamenei's Iran, in Xi Jinping's China, in support for those political prisoners who are a looking glass. What is needed now with respect to combating anti-Semitism is an understanding, as I said, and this has been the main theme of my work, that anti-Semitism is toxic to our democracies, that it cannot be fought by Jews alone, that it requires a global constituency of conscience to combat it, that in combating anti-Semitism, we are protecting our democracies, we are protecting human dignity, we are protecting other targeted minorities who then get caught up in that oldest and most ignominious of hatreds. And so I say to you as I close this lecture, that the Santa Fe lecture should be an inspiration for all of us, individually and collectively, to not only engage in acts of remembrance and reminder, which, as we meet on the 74th anniversaries, as I said, of both the Genocide Convention and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we should be, but to also engage in action itself, so that these days are not only days of remembrance or acts of remembrance, but they become remembrance to act. Each of us individually, all of us collectively, on behalf of our common humanity. Thank you.
Professor Cotler, thank you so much for giving this introduction to us today. You've combined in the talk the issues of anti-Semitism and authoritarianism. And by the way you've combined them, I know you're working in terms that they are linked. Could you comment on that specifically?
The common theme in all of it is really that we're witnessing today an assault on the democratic order, on the values that underpin democracy. The resurgent global authoritarianism, the resurgent autocracies are really engaged in an assault on the most fundamental of values. You know, Winston Churchill was right when he said democracy may be the worst form of government except for every other form of government. And the people who are rising in the streets in Iran as we speak, in what is under the motto women, life, freedom, they are fighting for universal fundamental values, and those values should resonate and speak for us and with us. And similarly, with regard to anti-Semitism, it's democracy itself that ends up being under attack. You know, we recently commemorated the Kristallnacht, 84th anniversary of Kristallnacht. And what was so interesting about it when we commemorated, in Canada, we have Holocaust Education Month. November is Holocaust Education Month. We commemorated Kristallnacht, where in November 9th and 10th, 1938, some 1,500 synagogues were torched, thousands of schools and shops were themselves burned and assaulted. Over 100 Jews were murdered, and some 20,000 Jews were rounded up and sent to the concentration camps like Dachau. And Kristallnacht is often spoken of as the precursor to the Holocaust. But what is an important lesson from Kristallnacht and relates to us here today that is often forgotten or unknown is that Kristallnacht did not happen by accident. Dachau, the first concentration camp, was built in 1933 in a democratic Germany at the time. The Nuremberg race laws disenfranchising Jews were adopted in 1935 in Germany. The state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide, the demonizing of the Jew as prologue and justification for their mass murder began already in 33 to 1938. And so, as John Turner, who is a Canadian justice minister for whom I had my first employ, would always teach me, he would say, democracy doesn't happen by accident. You have to fight for it. You have to nurture it. You have to protect it. And whether we're speaking about that resurgent global authoritarianism that I mentioned, Russia, Iran, China, or whether we're speaking about anti-Semitism, democracy is under attack, and we have to protect it. And I recall 5 years ago when I was in Prague, we adopted the Prague Declaration on Democratic Renewal, which said at the time, democracy everywhere is under attack. And those of us who care about it must now come to its defense. That was at the time in 2017. In 2022, the situation is much worse. If we care about democracy, as I believe we do, we have to come to its defense. We have to hold those authoritarians accountable. We have to hold those who engage in anti-Semitism accountable. And we have to do that, as I said, in the name of and on behalf of and in furtherance of our shared democracy and democratic values.
We have a number of questions from the audience, and I'd like to pass some of these along to you. Let's see. Sid Edelman is asking, what actions do you suggest specifically in relation to the anti-Semitism? Now, you answered part of that, and but I don't know, do you have other comments?
Yes, in terms of specific actions with regard to anti-Semitism, I think number one, we need more Holocaust education, and we need more education anti-Semitism. You know, the data showed this. We had, in fact, examinations done both in the US and Canada some 4 years ago, which demonstrated that 50% of millennials, for example, were unable to name one concentration camp, had never heard of Auschwitz. And so we have to educate about not only the lessons of the Holocaust, but what led to the Holocaust. And the encouraging part of those surveys was that 85% wanted to know more about it. And so I think we need to mandate Holocaust education and begin in the late elementary school and through high school at this point. But not only education about the Holocaust, we need education anti-Semitism. We can't just talk, as Dara Horn would say, about dead Jews, as important as that is to learn the lessons from that. We need to speak about the historical roots and contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism. So we need to educate, not only read the Holocaust, but educate anti-Semitism. In fact, Canada was one of the many countries that adopted what's called Malmo pledges. In October of last year, there was a conference in Malmo, Sweden, on Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. Participating countries, that included the US and Canada, were asked to develop Malmo pledges. And amongst the pledges that Canada adopted, and I would recommend, you know, in terms of what can be done to combat anti-Semitism, was not only that we needed, as we put in our pledge, education re the Holocaust and education re anti-Semitism across generational lines, but combating the increasing Holocaust denial and distortion. And I'm delighted that both our countries co-sponsored a resolution at the UN General Assembly last January 20th, on the anniversary of the Wannsee meeting, to combat Holocaust denial and distortion, which is increasing as we speak. A third thing is the importance, and it's in our Malmo pledges, of enhancing the adoption and implementation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition on anti-Semitism. It's an important definition. It's actually anchored in a human rights approach. It's anchored in an equality rights approach as follows: that traditional anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in the family of nations. What is common to both forms of anti-Semitism, traditional and new, is discrimination. All that has happened is moved from discrimination against Jews as individuals to the discrimination against Jews as a people, reverberating back against Jews as individuals. And we need to combat both. And they are both an assault on equality rights. So this is another Malmo pledge that we took to enhance the adoption and implementation of the IRA working definition. Another one that comes to mind is in Canada on January 17th, we have Raoul Wallenberg Commemorative Day in remembrance of Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish non-Jew who demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. It's not all that well known that between May and July 1944, 440,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to the death camp Auschwitz. Nobody could say at that time we did not know what was happening. And so and this was the cruelest, most efficient, quickest killing field in all of the Holocaust. Raoul Wallenberg arrived as a Swedish diplomat in the Swedish legation in Budapest in July 1944. And in a mixture of bluff and bravado and ingenuity and inspiration and mobilizing other diplomats with him, he then went on to save the remnant of 100,000 Jews. So what the entire international bystander community did not do, one person, as I said, with the compassion to care and the courage to act it. And that's why we established Raoul Wallenberg Commemorative Day. It takes place on January 17th, the day of his disappearance in 1945 into the Soviet Gulag at the time, his fate remaining unknown. But one of the things in the Malmo pledges is we are to teach about Raoul Wallenberg's life and legacy to young people today who are somewhat cynical about issues re human rights, and demonstrate through Raoul Wallenberg what each of us are capable of doing. One can say, well, we can't be Raoul. Everyone has the capacity every day to do one good deed that can change the ledger of justice from evil to good. I'm reminded here, I'll close with it, that Maimonides said that we should each see the world as divided into half evil and half good. Therefore, one good deed by any one of us at any given moment in time transfers and transforms a ledger from evil to good. And so I think this is something we should think about. Every day, we should be able to find one good deed to do. And Raoul Wallenberg is a kind of looking glass for that type of legacy.
Don Goldstein has a question about how would you compare the historical and present day anti-Semitism between the United States and Canada?
Well, I think that, both countries, US and Canada, when I grew up in the campus culture of the 60s as a student, and then in the 70s thereon as a law professor, those were good times, both in the US and Canada. When I see the situation, and just using the campus cultures as a case study today, things are very different. Jewish students today are apprehensive, not only about their security and their safety, but we had in Canada the first ever national emergency summit to combat anti-Semitism. I think we're the only country that did this. We did it in July 2021. And there were two pieces of testimony that were very compelling, the lived experiences that were given by the Jewish participants. And I just want to say that at that national summit, we had the presence of the Prime Minister, of 10 government ministers involved in aspects of combating anti-Semitism, parliamentarianism across parties, and a diverse expression of the Jewish community. And Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who opened the conference, then said at the close that there were two testimonies that were very moving for him. And I share them because I think there's a commonality here between the US and Canada. The first was a University of Toronto student who said, look, he said, I'm what you would call a progressive student. I'm part of the left-wing student group. He said, but on the campus, I'm being forced to choose between my Jewish identity and acceptance into the campus culture. I'm being stereotyped and stigmatized and marginalized and excluded as being a representative of a white privileged supremacist class, as I referenced earlier. I'm being stigmatized as an apologist for the apartheid state of Israel. I'm being silenced in the campus culture. The second was a Black Jewish woman who said, I really embody, if you will, what is intersectionality. I'm Black, I'm a woman, and I'm Jewish, but I'm being targeted mostly because of my Jewishness. And she too expressed another phenomenon where intersectionality has been turned on its head. I think back during the 70s, and with this I'll close. At that time, the Jews in North America, US Jews, Canadian Jews, we in effect patented intersectionality in the best sense in terms of the struggle for Soviet Jewry. We had students for Soviet Jewry, women for Soviet Jewry, lawyers for Soviet Jewry, parliamentarians for Soviet Jewry, scientists for Soviet Jewry, academics for Soviet Jewry. Today, each of those constituencies has turned around and in fact is scapegoating Jews in many cases. And so we need to mobilize again that constituency of conscience. As we did it with regard to Soviet Jewry, so must we do it for the combating of anti-Semitism. And I think here in the US and Canada, we have a shared common cause.
We have one more question, and we're at kind of the end of our hour now, but we have another question that we can address. Perhaps this is the last one. It comes from Sipora Nefesh, and she mentions that this linkage between authoritarianism and anti-Semitism she sees as a response to the massive changes that have been going on in recent decades and people's fear of change. So she's asking, to what extent is fear an underlying cause of these things? And if so, how would it be addressed?
Well, fear is part of it. And certainly, as we've seen again in terms of the various zeitgeists that I showed, fear is part of those zeitgeists, whether it's regard to the Jews poisoning the wells, and then in the Middle Ages, that trope then or now with regard to COVID, and COVID has its own set of fears. Sure, fear is part of it, but we should think back as well, in terms of authoritarianism and anti-Semitism. Think back to the former Soviet Union. That's where that trope about Zionism and apartheid began. It was the Soviet Union that brought about the Zionism as racism resolution at the UN General Assembly. And Elie Wiesel was my teacher, my mentor, my colleague, my friend. When he wrote in 1965 the book, The Jews of Silence, he wasn't talking about the Jews of the former Soviet Union. He was talking about the Jews in North America, and that helped awaken the Jews of silence here. And I think it's the same thing today. I think we are seeing responses to the attempt to intimidate, to sow fear and the like in Russia, in Iran, on its citizens and so on. But the people are showing incredible courage. As we're meeting today, they're in the streets in Iran protesting, women, men, students, etc., and really facing extreme brutality and repression. But they're responding to what should be a climate of fear with incredible moral courage. And I think that's, there is fear, and there's fear in the campus cultures in the US and Canada, etc. But we have to combat that fear by rising up and beginning to combat the resurgent global authoritarianism that I sought to characterize in terms of those case studies, to think of those political prisoners in each of those countries who show how they are combating that fear and how they have been demonstrating and are exemplars of moral courage. And I think it's the same thing here too with regard to anti-Semitism. One has to stand up and confront it and unmask it and expose it and hold it accountable. The more that will be involved, the more that are mobilized, the more that will be engaged in confronting it, the less people will feel unsafe, insecure, and afraid. And that's why I said we need, at this point, a global mobilization of a constituency of conscience to combat anti-Semitism, to combat that attempt to intimidate us, and to respond to it with the kind of courage that these political prisoners are role models for. And if we can engage in a little bit of that ourselves, I think we will help to not only combat it, but to defeat it.
I think one of the most disturbing things that's happening today that you mentioned earlier is that the anti-racism movement is excluding anti-Semitism, and on the contrary, is actually accusing Jews. That point that you made is one of the most disturbing, I think, that we're facing.
That's right. And on the one hand, we're not seen as having standing to participate in the anti-racism movement, and on the other hand, we're actually being accused of being racist ourselves. So it's that double-barreled false indictment that we have to combat, and that is, some of what we are trying to do now. We have a coalition of special envoys. Deborah Lipstadt, the U.S. Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism from the U.S. We have people like Katharina von Schnurbein from the European Union. We have Fernando Lotenberg from the Organization of American States. So we now have developed a coalition of special envoys that is beginning to not only fight back, but to start to take the initiative and to put those who are maligning and bullying and excluding and stereotyping and stigmatizing Jews, put them on the defense, hold them to account as we affirm our shared democratic values.
Professor Cotler, thank you so much for being here with us today and bringing the importance of this, what we're confronting today, the rise of authoritarianism, the genocidal issues that we're facing, the anti-Semitism. Thank you so much for coming and speaking so poignantly about the situation today.
Well, thank you for having me. As I said, we came together at an important moment of remembrance, and now it's up to us to remember to act.